The morning mist clung to the peaks of the Cascade Range like ghostly fingers, and I should have taken it as a warning. My name is David Chen, and what I'm about to tell you happened 3 years ago during what was supposed to be a routine day hike in the Olympic Mountains of Washington State. I've told this story to park rangers, search and rescue teams, and therapists, but I've never written it down. The nightmares have finally subsided enough that I think I can manage it now. It was October 15, 2021. I remember the date because it was my girlfriend Sarah's birthday, and I'd planned this hike as a surprise adventure before her party that evening. We were both experienced hikers, or so we thought. The trail to Blue Lake was rated moderate, a 6-mile round trip that should have taken us 4 hours maximum. We'd packed light, water, granola bars, a basic first aid kit, and my phone with a portable charger. The weather forecast called for partly cloudy skies with temperatures in the mid-50s. Perfect hiking weather. We started at 8 a.m. from the Deer Creek trailhead. The parking lot was nearly empty, just our Honda Civic and an old pickup truck with Oregon plates. I remember feeling pleased about having the trail mostly to ourselves. Sarah was in high spirits, her blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing her favorite red fleece jacket that would later become both a blessing and a curse. The first 2 miles were exactly what we expected. The trail was well marked, winding through old-growth forest with occasional glimpses of the surrounding peaks. We made good time, stopping occasionally to photograph a particularly impressive Douglas fir or to listen to the distant calls of ravens echoing through the valleys. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the earthy scent of decomposing leaves and the faint sweetness of late-blooming wildflowers. It was at the 2.5-mile mark that everything went wrong. The trail forked, and there was no sign. I pulled out my phone to check the GPS, but we were in a dead zone, no signal whatsoever. I had downloaded an offline map, but when I tried to access it, my phone screen flickered and went black. The battery showed full charge when I'd checked it 20 minutes earlier, but now it was completely dead. "Which way do you think?" Sarah asked, pointing to the 2 paths diverging into the forest. The main trail seemed to continue straight ahead, while a smaller, less maintained path branched off to the right. I studied both options. The straight path looked more traveled, with fewer fallen branches and a clearer tread. The right fork appeared narrower, overgrown with huckleberry bushes and salmonberry, but there were what looked like trail blazes carved into a few trees. Let's stick to the main trail, I decided. The right fork might be an old logging road or a dead-end spur trail. We continued straight for another mile, but something felt off. The trail was becoming progressively less defined, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we should have reached the lake by now. The forest around us was growing denser, the canopy blocking out more of the sky. The temperature seemed to be dropping, and that cheerful morning light was fading to a dull gray. "Dave, I think we should turn back," Sarah said, voicing what I was beginning to think myself. "This doesn't feel right." But I was stubborn. I convinced myself that we just needed to push on a little further, that the lake was probably just around the next bend. I'd studied the trail map obsessively the night before, and I was certain we were going the right way. How wrong I was. Another half hour passed. The trail had dwindled to little more than a game path, barely visible through the underbrush. We were climbing steadily now, much more steeply than the moderate grade the trail description had promised. My legs were burning, and I could hear Sarah breathing heavily behind me. That's when we heard it. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. We both froze, our hearts hammering. The sound echoed through the trees, impossible to pinpoint. It could have been a bear, a cougar, or something else entirely. In that moment, surrounded by the silent forest, it sounded like the voice of the mountain itself, warning us that we didn't belong here. "Dave," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "We need to leave. Now." I nodded, and we began to retrace our steps as quietly as possible. But here's where our situation went from bad to catastrophic. We couldn't find the trail we'd been following. Somewhere in our panic, we'd lost the already faint path completely. The forest floor looked the same in every direction, a carpet of fallen leaves, fallen logs, and dense undergrowth that seemed to close in around us like a living maze. I tried to stay calm, to think logically. The basic rule of wilderness navigation is to stay put when you're lost, to make yourself visible to searchers. But we were already hours overdue for Sarah's birthday party, and I knew people would start to worry. More immediately, The temperature was dropping fast, and we could see our breath in the air. The forecast had been wrong, storm clouds were gathering overhead, and I could smell rain in the air. We needed to find shelter and get warm, fast. For the next hour, we pushed through the forest, trying to find any recognizable landmark or trail. The undergrowth was thick with devil's club, its spines tearing at our clothes and skin. I was wearing only a light jacket over a t-shirt, and Sarah's red fleece was already snagged and torn in several places. Every step seemed to take us deeper into an impossible tangle of vegetation. The growling sound came again, closer this time. Much closer. We climbed a fallen log to get a better view of our surroundings, and what we saw made my blood run cold. We were in a narrow valley surrounded by steep ridges on all sides. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, a green ocean of trees that seemed to go on forever. There was no sign of the parking lot, no sign of the main trail, no sign of anything human at all. But there was something else. About 50 yards away, partially hidden behind a stand of cedar trees, was what looked like a small clearing. And in that clearing, I could make out what appeared to be structures of some kind. "Do you see that?" I asked Sarah, pointing toward the clearing. She squinted through the trees. "Are those buildings?" They were buildings, of a sort. As we got closer, we could see that they were old, very old. 3 small cabins arranged in a rough triangle around what had once been a fire pit. The roofs were partially collapsed, and the walls were gray with age and weather. Moss and small trees grew from the foundations. These weren't ranger stations or modern shelters, they looked like they'd been abandoned for decades. The smart thing would have been to stay away from them. Every horror movie ever made should have taught us that much. But we were cold, scared, and running out of daylight. One of the cabins looked like it might still have a partially intact roof, and right then, any shelter was better than spending the night in the open. The door to the least damaged cabin was hanging open, creaking softly in the wind. I pushed it open carefully, listening for any sound from inside. The interior was small, maybe 10 feet by 12 feet, with a single window that was so dirty it let in almost no light. There was an old wooden table, 2 chairs, and what looked like the remains of a bed frame in one corner. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust and debris. But it was the walls that made my skin crawl. They were covered in writing. Not graffiti or casual markings, but desperate, frantic scratchings carved directly into the wood. Most of it was illegible, but I could make out a few phrases. Day 12, still no sign of the trail. The sounds at night are getting closer. Sarah thinks we're being watched. If anyone finds this, don't trust the trail markers. I felt Sarah grab my arm. "Dave, look at this." She was pointing to a section of the wall near the window. Carved more deeply than the rest, in letters that looked fresher than the others, was a single word: run. Below it, in what looked like a different hand, someone had scratched, "They were the faces of the lost." The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Sarah was shivering visibly now, and I could see goosebumps on her arms. But it wasn't just the cold that was making us shake. "We can't stay here," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to agree with her, but outside the wind was picking up, and I could hear the first drops of rain beginning to fall on the roof. Night was coming fast in the deep forest, and we were already hypothermic. We needed shelter, and this was the only option we had. "Just for tonight," I said. "We'll leave first thing in the morning." We spent the next hour gathering dry wood and debris to make a fire in the old fireplace. The chimney was partially blocked, so the cabin filled with smoke, but the warmth was welcome. We ate our granola bars and shared our water, trying to ration what little we had left. Sarah huddled close to me, and I could feel her trembling. As darkness fell, the forest outside came alive with sounds. Not the normal sounds of nighttime wildlife, but something else. Footsteps that seemed to circle the cabin. Branches snapping under weight that was too heavy to be a deer or elk. And always, that low growling that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. "Dave," Sarah whispered around midnight, "there's something outside the window." I looked where she was pointing, and my heart nearly stopped. There was a face pressed against the glass, pale and distorted in the flickering firelight. But it wasn't quite right somehow. The features seemed wrong, too sharp, too angular. The eyes reflected the fire like an animal's, but they were positioned too high on the head. I grabbed a burning stick from the fire and moved toward the window. The face disappeared instantly, but I could hear heavy footsteps moving around the outside of the cabin. They circled us for what felt like hours, sometimes stopping directly outside the door, sometimes at the window. Once, something scraped against the walls with what sounded like claws. Sarah was crying quietly now, trying to muffle the sound with her hands. I held her close, whispering reassurances I didn't believe myself. Every shadow cast by the dying fire seemed to move independently, and I found myself jumping at every small sound. Around 3 a.m., the footsteps stopped. The forest fell silent except for the gentle patter of rain on the roof. We must have dozed off from exhaustion, because the next thing I remember was waking to pale gray light filtering through the dirty window. Sarah was already awake, staring at the door. "Dave," she said softly, "look." There were scratches on the inside of the door. Deep gouges in the wood that definitely hadn't been there the night before. They were too high to have been made by any normal animal, and they seemed to form a pattern, almost like letters. I didn't want to think about what might have made those marks, or how something could have gotten inside the cabin to make them. The door had been barred from the inside all night. We packed up quickly and left the cabin, stepping out into a world transformed by the storm. The rain had stopped, but everything was soaked and dripping. The forest seemed different in the morning light, more threatening somehow. The trees pressed in closer, and the undergrowth seemed thicker and more impenetrable than it had the day before. I tried to retrace our steps from the previous day, but nothing looked familiar. Every direction looked the same, dense forest stretching endlessly in all directions. We were completely, hopelessly lost. That's when we found the trail markers. They were small wooden signs nailed to trees, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. They seemed to indicate a trail leading up the ridge to our east. The markers were old and weathered, but they were definitely man-made. Someone had been through here before, someone who had marked a route. We followed the markers for 2 hours, climbing steadily through increasingly difficult terrain. The trail, if it could be called that, was overgrown and treacherous. We had to push through dense patches of devil's club and scramble over fallen logs. My hands were cut and bleeding from the thorns, and Sarah's red fleece was now torn in so many places it looked like it had been shredded by claws. But the markers continued, leading us ever upward. I began to feel a spark of hope. Maybe these markers would lead us to a lookout point where we could see the surrounding area, or maybe to another trail that would take us back to civilization. The hope died when we reached the end of the marked trail. It terminated at the edge of a cliff, a sheer drop of at least 200 feet into a rocky canyon below. There was no way down, no way forward, no way anywhere except back the way we'd come. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what we found at the cliff's edge. There was a pile of personal belongings scattered among the rocks and stunted trees. Backpacks, water bottles, pieces of clothing, all weathered and faded by years of exposure. And hanging from a nearby tree, fluttering in the wind like a grotesque flag, was a red fleece jacket almost identical to Sarah's. She made a sound that was half sob, half scream, and I felt something cold and terrible settle in my stomach. These were the belongings of other hikers, other people who had followed these same markers to this cliff edge. The trail markers hadn't been placed by park rangers or other hikers trying to help. They'd been placed by something else, something that wanted to lead people to this place. I grabbed Sarah's hand and we ran. We crashed through the forest with no regard for direction or safety, just desperate to get away from that awful place. Branches whipped at our faces, and we fell repeatedly, scraping our knees and hands on rocks and fallen logs. Behind us, I could hear something crashing through the underbrush, keeping pace with us but staying just out of sight. We ran until we couldn't run anymore, then collapsed against a massive cedar tree, gasping for breath. My chest felt like it was on fire, and I could taste blood in my mouth. Sarah was sobbing uncontrollably, her face scratched and bleeding from the branches. "We're going to die here," she whispered. "We're never going to get out." I wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay, but I was beginning to think she might be right. We were completely lost, we were being stalked by something that wasn't quite human, and we were running out of time. The temperature was dropping again, and dark clouds were gathering overhead for another storm. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of running water. "Do you hear that?" I asked Sarah. She stopped crying and listened. Water. It's water. Water meant a stream, and streams eventually lead to larger bodies of water, which often have trails or roads nearby. It was our best hope, maybe our only hope. We followed the sound through the forest, moving as quietly as we could. The sound of our pursuer had faded, but I didn't trust that it was gone. Every few minutes, I would stop and listen, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The stream, when we found it, was larger than I'd expected, more of a small river than a creek. It was running fast and high from the recent rain, but it was definitely flowing downhill, which meant it would eventually lead us out of the mountains. We followed the stream bank for what felt like hours. The going was easier than crashing through the forest, but it was still difficult. The bank was muddy and slippery, and we had to navigate around fallen trees and large boulders. Several times we had to wade through shallow sections where the bank was too steep or overgrown to follow. It was during one of these river crossings that I saw them. Footprints in the mud on the opposite bank. But not normal footprints, these were too long, too narrow, with what looked like claw marks at the tips of the toes. They were fresh, made sometime after the rain had stopped that morning. And they were following the same route we were. I didn't tell Sarah about the footprints. She was already barely holding it together, and I didn't want to send her into complete panic. But I started looking over my shoulder more frequently, and I picked up the pace as much as I dared. The stream began to widen as we descended, and I started to see signs of human activity. First, an old beer can caught in some branches, the first piece of litter I'd ever been happy to see. Then, a piece of fishing line tangled around a boulder. These were small signs, but they meant that people came to the stream, probably to fish. As afternoon wore on, I began to hear a new sound over the rush of the water, the distant hum of traffic. My heart leapt. A road. There was a road somewhere ahead of us. We pushed on, energized by the possibility of rescue. The sound of traffic grew louder, and through the trees ahead I could see a break in the forest canopy. We were almost there. But our pursuer wasn't done with us yet. The attack came when we were less than 100 yards from the road. I heard Sarah scream behind me, and I spun around to see her on the ground, something dark and large looming over her. It was humanoid in shape but wrong in every detail, too tall, too thin, with arms that seemed too long for its body. Its face was a nightmare fusion of human and animal features, with eyes that reflected light like mirrors and teeth that were too sharp and too numerous. I grabbed a fallen branch and swung it at the thing's head. The branch connected with a sickening crack, and the creature stumbled backward, making a sound like nothing I'd ever heard, part roar, part scream, part something else entirely inhuman. Run! I shouted to Sarah, and we sprinted toward the road. We burst out of the forest onto the shoulder of a 2-lane highway, and I've never been so happy to see asphalt in my life. Cars were passing in both directions, and I stepped into the road, waving my arms frantically. A pickup truck pulled over, and the driver, an elderly man in a flannel shirt, rolled down his window. "You folks okay?" he asked, taking in our torn clothes and wild appearance. "We're lost hikers," I gasped. "We need to get to a phone, call for help." He nodded and gestured for us to get in. As I helped Sarah into the truck, I looked back at the forest. There, just visible in the shadows between the trees, stood the creature that had been hunting us. It was watching us with those terrible mirror eyes, but it made no move to follow us onto the road. The man drove us to the nearest ranger station, where we spent the next several hours giving statements and talking to search and rescue personnel. They were skeptical of our story, particularly the parts about the creature and the misleading trail markers. The official report listed us as disoriented hikers who became lost due to poor navigation and adverse weather conditions. But I know what I saw. Sarah knows what she saw. And when the rangers went back to investigate the area where we'd been lost, they couldn't find the old cabins, the cliff with the scattered belongings, or any trace of the trail markers that had led us astray. The only thing they found was the stream we'd followed out, and even that didn't match our description. According to their GPS readings, the stream we'd followed should have been impossible. It would have required water to flow uphill for several miles. I've done research since then, digging through old newspaper archives and missing persons reports. There have been dozens of disappearances in that area over the past 50 years. Experienced hikers who went into the forest and were never seen again. The official explanations are always the same: they got lost, fell from a cliff, were attacked by a bear, or simply decided to disappear and start new lives elsewhere. But I found other accounts, buried in old online forums and survivor testimonies that were never officially recorded. Stories of misleading trail markers, of creatures that wear almost human faces, of sounds in the forest that don't belong to any known animal. We were lucky. We got out. But I know that thing is still out there, still hunting, still leading people astray with its false markers and its patient, predatory intelligence. The nightmares have mostly stopped now, but I still can't go hiking. I can't even walk through the small patch of woods behind my apartment without feeling like I'm being watched. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear that low, guttural growling that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sarah and I broke up 6 months after the incident. We couldn't talk about what happened without both of us falling apart, and we could not talk about it. It was always there between us, the knowledge that we'd seen something that wasn't supposed to exist, something that had marked us in ways we couldn't explain to others. I'm writing this now because I've heard that there have been more disappearances in the same area recently. 3 experienced hikers in the past month, all of them following what they thought were legitimate trail markers. I've contacted the Park Service, tried to warn them, but they won't listen. They think I'm just another traumatized hiker who's letting his imagination run wild. So I'm putting this story out there, hoping that someone will read it and take it seriously. If you're planning to hike in the Olympic Mountains, particularly in the areas around Deer Creek and Blue Lake, please be careful. Don't trust trail markers that aren't on official maps. Don't follow paths that seem too convenient or too perfectly marked. And if you hear that low, guttural growling echoing through the trees, don't try to find its source. Don't investigate. Don't convince yourself it's just a bear or an elk. Run. Run as fast as you can, and don't look back. Because some things in the deep forest are older than human civilization, older than our understanding of what's possible in this world. They've learned to use our own tools against us, our trust in trail markers, our instinct to seek shelter, our tendency to help others in distress. The forest remembers, even when we try to forget. It remembers the people who went in and never came out, and it's always hungry for more. Don't become another story like mine. Don't become another pile of belongings at the bottom of a cliff, another name on a missing persons report that will never be solved. Stay on the marked trails. Stay with other hikers. And never, ever trust a path that seems too good to be true. Because in the deep forest, the things that hunt us have learned to be patient. They've learned to be clever. And they've learned that the best way to catch prey is to make them think they're being rescued. The trail markers are still out there, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting hikers. The creature is still out there, wearing its almost human face and making its inhuman sounds in the darkness between the trees. And sometimes, when I'm lying in bed on quiet nights, I can still hear it calling my name. This account was compiled from interviews with David Chen, conducted between 2022 and 2024. Mr. Chen has requested that the specific location of his ordeal not be disclosed in detail, but he hopes that sharing his story will help prevent similar incidents. The Olympic National Forest Service has not responded to requests for comment regarding the claims made in this testimony. If you have experienced similar encounters in the Olympic Mountains or other wilderness areas, please contact the National Missing Persons Database or local search and rescue authorities. Do not attempt to investigate these areas alone. Remember, the forest doesn't forgive mistakes. The forest doesn't forget. And the forest is always watching. Hey everyone, thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like and subscribe button, and then share with your friends. Your support helps us grow and create even more awesome content. We appreciate you being part of the journey. Here are a couple more videos for you to check out.